Hello everyone and welcome to this week's episode of How Is This Movie? My name is Dana Buckler and thank you for taking just a little time out of your day to listen. Be sure to follow us on Twitter at HowIsThisMovie, like us on Facebook at facebook.com/HowIsThisMovie, visit our website hitmpodcast.blogspot.com for movie trailers and reviews. We are also on the Stitcher Smart Radio app. If you enjoy the show, please feel free to leave us a review both on iTunes and on Stitcher. Now, this episode is not business, it's personal. For almost 30 years, I have been tormented by an experience I had in early 1985. See, I'm the youngest of 4 siblings. I have a brother a year older than me, and I have 2 sisters who are 6 and 4 years older than me, respectively. Now, let me set the tone for the story I'm going to share with you. In 1985, there were computers, but no internet. There were VCRs, but no instant streaming services. And there was cable, but not 500 channels with 30 premium movie channels. I say all this because nowadays it can be much easier for children to accidentally be exposed to content they shouldn't see. I was 7 years old in 85, and I like to think that my parents did a good job keeping me sheltered from things I shouldn't see. But technology was starting to creep in, albeit very slowly, but it was present. In this case, I'm referring to the family VCR. The 45-pound monstrosity that sat in our living room. And you know how kids today are much more tech-savvy than us grown-ups? The same could be said about my understanding of how the VCR worked. Even at 7, I didn't find it complicated. I could use it with ease, even if my dad thought that just unhooking the coaxial cable would be enough to render it useless. I knew how to get that machine to work. So on a Saturday morning when my brother walked into my bedroom with a rented VHS tape in his hand and asked me if I wanted to watch a scary movie, I said sure. Only thing was that my expert knowledge would be needed to make sure the VCR would work correctly. Now what I didn't know at the time was that this wasn't a children's scary movie. This was a film that my brother had borrowed from a friend who lived down the street. A film that said friend's parents had rented, and those parents had no idea that it was in my brother's possession. The film was called A Nightmare on Elm Street, and within the first 5 minutes, I wasn't scared. I was terrified. The images on the screen were too much for my mind to process, yet I didn't stop watching it until it was over. Now, some kids are afraid of snakes, some are afraid of the dark, some are afraid of the monster that lives either in their closet or under their bed. The problem for me was that until that point, I wasn't really afraid of anything. That all changed that morning. I was now afraid of a terribly burned man with a red and green sweater, who had a glove on his right hand with razors attached to the fingers. And worst of all, this was a man that could get you when you were most vulnerable, when you're asleep. Freddy Krueger would be the person that forced me to sleep with my light on for years. The person who, no matter how many movies featuring him that I would watch, even the ones that he became more of a comedian in, I would still be scared to open my eyes whenever he was on screen. The fear was something I kept to myself. I couldn't let my friends know that I was afraid. The ridicule would have been relentless. Everything came full circle for me in 1998. I was at Universal Studios in Orlando, Florida. I was there to take part in their annual Halloween Horror Nights Spectacular. This is where the entire theme park is transformed into a series of haunted houses. The first haunted house I went into gave you 2 options in which way to enter. You could go left, and the house would give you a tribute to classic movie monsters, Dracula, Frankenstein, the Mummy. Or you could go right, and the house would give you a tribute to modern horror movie icons, Jason Voorhees, Michael Myers, Leatherface, Pinhead, and of course my nemesis, Freddy Krueger. Well, I wanted to go left. My friends insisted we go right. Again, I have no intentions of letting them know that even at the age 20 now, that I was scared to go that way. So we went right, made the first corner, walked down a hallway, and wouldn't you know, the first thing we come across was life-size wax figures of all those famous icons. Everyone got very close to get a better look, inspecting them over, and remarking at the level of detail. "Come closer, Dana," one of my friends said. Feeling very squeamish, I slowly approached the Freddy Krueger wax figure. Now something started to happen. I slowly became confident. I was staring into the eyes of the person that caused me so many sleepless nights. I mustered up the strength and shouted 4 words. "Fuck you, Freddy Krueger." I turned around to see if my response was audible to my friends, who hadn't noticed the vulgar greeting I had for Krueger. When I turned back, to my shock, Freddy's head was tilted in a different direction, and before I could register what was happening, his arms rose up and he began to walk towards me. Now, I've been scared more than a few times in my life, but this was a different type of fear. I didn't slowly walk backwards. I went into full sprint mode and ran right out the front entrance of that haunted house. And as I look back, he was chasing me. Freddy Krueger, the boogeyman of my childhood, was now chasing me through Universal Studios. Now, after what seemed like minutes, the reality is it was probably more like 15 seconds, he broke chase and returned to the haunted house, which I never went back to. Now, side note, it took me 3 hours to find my friends, who to this day still remind me of that night. And to this day, when the original Nightmare on Elm Street comes on TV and I'm alone with the lights off, I change the channel. But the film and its sequels didn't just have an impact on me. They are so ingrained in pop culture that years from now, when we look back on them, we'll look back on them like we do the classic Universal monsters. So let's take a closer look at the franchise and see where it all started. To get to 1984's A Nightmare on Elm Street, we have to chart the course of two individuals, Wes Craven and Robert Shaye. In 1967, Robert Shaye founded New Line Cinema, a film distribution company that would show art house pictures and foreign films to places like libraries and college campuses. Shaye had an eye for many films that the general movie public would miss. He would also distribute a number of John Waters films, but it would be a film from 1936 that would make Shaye some real money. Shaye was watching 1936's Reefer Madness, a pure propaganda film about the dangers of smoking marijuana, when he noticed the copyright logo was inaccurate. This meant the film was in public domain. Now, like I mentioned, Shaye had modest success showing films to colleges and was looking for a hook. He found it in Reefer Madness. With the liberal-minded college students who embraced smoking pot as part of their daily routine, Shaye knew this ridiculous anti-pot movie would go over like gangbusters. So with the film in his trunk, Shaye went from school to school to school, college campuses, showing the film, and he made a hefty amount of money from those screenings. So by 1976, Shaye was ready to throw his hat into the filmmaking ring. Along with the money he made from film distribution, he was able to raise some additional funds needed for New Line Cinema's first ever release, a film called Stunts, about the world of Hollywood stuntmen. The film tanked at the box office. Undeterred, Bob Shaye and New Line financed 3 more films, a sci-fi film called Extro, another John Waters film called Polyester, and a horror movie called Alone in the Dark. Now, the director of Alone in the Dark is Jack Shoulder. I want you to remember that name for a little later on. But in 1983, it was becoming very clear that the current model that New Line was using wasn't working, and it wasn't going to last. Their next film needed to be a hit. They needed money. And in the middle of 1983, a script came across the desk of Bob Shaye. The script was written by Wes Craven. Now, Wes Craven didn't start out in the film industry. He began a career working as a college professor teaching humanities. The work didn't satisfy him. So in 1970, he ditched the teacher career for something a little more exciting, filmmaking. But not the kind of filmmaking you'd associate him with. No, Craven got his start in the seedy world of adult films. This is something he acknowledges, but to this day does not mention any of the productions he worked on by name. However, a detailed internet search will produce some of those titles. In 1972, Craven made his first feature film, a low-budget horror film that caused so much controversy that theater projectionists would make their own edits of the film before screening them for the patrons. The film, The Last House on the Left, was an exploitation film that dealt with a married couple's revenge on the killers who murdered their daughter. The film was made on a budget of $87,000 and took in $3.1 million. And although it did have some strong reviews, it was banned in a ton of countries for its brutal scenes of violence and harsh sexual assault. But because of the film's modest success, Craven was able to keep working on feature films. His next breakthrough film was 1977's The Hills Have Eyes, a film that made a staggering $25 million at the box office. It made Craven a hot commodity in Hollywood. He would parlay the success of The Hills Have Eyes into his biggest production to date, 1982's Swamp Thing. After the success of Superman and its sequel, Hollywood was looking to translate more comic books into films, and Swamp Thing was a DC property. However, the film failed to translate well with audiences, many of whom had never read the comic or even knew of its existence. The film was a bomb, and Craven, well, he was lost in the shuffle, trying to regroup and get things back on track. In the late 1970s, Craven read a series of LA Times articles about a group of Cambodian refugees in the United States that were dying in their sleep. The refugees were so scared of falling asleep that they would do anything to stay awake. And when they finally did sleep, they wouldn't wake up. Craven pondered what would happen if you knew that falling asleep would kill you. He also questioned what was killing them.
You know, there was a very interesting series of articles in the LA Times over a year and a half of kids that were dying in the middle of nightmares. And all three cases were the same, and the LA Times never correlated, and they never caught that they had written, published a previous story. But the third story is the perfect example, because it was the most developed. Kid has a nightmare. He tells his parents, "I had a nightmare last night." They say, "Yeah, yada yada. We all have them from time to time. Don't be bothered." And he says, "No, this is different. It was worse than anything I've ever had. It was much more real. In fact, I was so scared I don't want to sleep anymore." I say, "Right, yeah, okay."
And this is true.
The next night comes, they hear walking around, they wake up, go down. The kid's in the living room, lights on, does not want to sleep. This goes on for the whole night, the whole next night, to the point that they think, and this was an immigrant family from Southeast Asia, they're convinced he's having some kind of a nervous breakdown. They call the doctor gives them sleepy pills. "Take your sleepy pills?" "Yeah, Mom." The next day they find him hidden under his pillow. Then, like on the fifth day, they find a coffee pot in his closet, because they're all trying to get him to sleep. They bring him warm milk at night. He goes to bed. As soon as they're asleep, he wakes up. He's down in the living room with all the lights on. So they were very concerned about him. And I think on the 6th or 7th night, he was up an extraordinary amount of time. He was haggard and everything else. He finally fell asleep, in the living room with the television going. They turned off the television, turned off the lights. Father carried him up to the bed, put him to bed. Everybody said, "Thank God we can rest." In the middle of the night, they hear this incredible screaming, thrashing. They run into the room. Before they got to him, fall still, deader than a doornail.
No.
Swear to God.
No.
And this is the third story I've read like this. And I just said, my gosh, what if there were something really after people? I mean, it seems like there was. When you're asleep, how vulnerable would you be?
The idea was planted, and Craven began working on a story that focused more on what happened to the person once they fell asleep and explored the dreamscape as the setting for the story. He crafted a story about a man named Freddy Krueger, who was a child molester that after he was arrested for his crimes, is set free due to a legal technicality. The parents of his victims hunt Krueger down and burn him alive. It's then years later that Krueger comes back to stalk and kill the teenagers of those parents in their dreams. When Craven finished the script, entitled A Nightmare on Elm Street, he began a series of pitch meetings with different Hollywood studios. Most passed on the project for the same reason. They didn't feel that people would buy the idea that your dreams could kill you. Ironically, Walt Disney Studios actually expressed interest, but wanted Craven to obviously tone down the harshness of the story to make it safe for preteens and children. Craven refused. All in all, it took the script 3 years to make its way to New Line and Bob Shaye. Now, Bob Shaye loved the story, and he wanted to move forward on the project. After 6 months of pre-production, A Nightmare on Elm Street started principal photography in 1984. The film was given a $1.8 million budget, and that was more money than New Line Cinema had on hand, and a lot of side deals had to happen for Bob Shaye to get all the funds he needed. When it came to casting the film, there was a mix of newcomers and a few recognizable faces brought in to fill out the cast. For the role of the protagonist, Nancy, Heather Langenkamp was cast. Prior to that role, Langenkamp had had a few minor roles, including a small part in Francis Ford Coppola's The Outsiders. The role of Tina went to Amanda Weiss, who had done quite a bit of TV work and had a role as Judge Reinhold's girlfriend in Fast Times at Ridgemont High. For the role of Rod Lane, Cuban-American Jesus Garcia was cast in the role. Now, interesting thing about Garcia was that he went under the screen name Nick Corri, C-O-R-R-I. He felt that he would find it easier to get cast in roles with an Italian name than a Spanish last name. For Nancy's boyfriend Glenn, the role went to a first-time actor who auditioned numerous times for the part. Craven was really on the fence about whether or not to go with him. He had a slew of all-American-looking actors vying for the role, but it would be his daughter that would give him the confidence to go with Johnny Depp. She saw his headshot and was in love, told her father that he was, quote, dreamy. For Nancy's mother, Craven went with an Academy Award nominee, Ronnie Blakely. She rose to fame after her role in Robert Altman's Nashville. And for Nancy's father, Detective Thompson, Craven went with B-movie superstar John Saxon. Saxon had more than 100 different acting roles before coming on board Elm Street. And rounding out the cast was Robert Englund, the actor who would benefit the most from his role in this film. Englund had a lot of TV work under his belt before taking the now iconic role, including parts in Charlie's Angels and the miniseries V.
I was involved and very preoccupied with a television series, actually a miniseries at that time called V, which was very good for my career, very popular. And I was thinking to myself, oh boy, you're going to be stuck in this series for the next 5 years, playing this sort of little nerdy, benign, E.T.-like alien. And I had a hiatus between the miniseries and the series, and this project came along. And I'd heard a lot about Wes Craven and seen his films and was very curious. It sort of struck me as a kind of a dark genius. And I'd worked for Tobe Hooper before and really enjoyed the experience. So I said, this might be something new. And I, at that time, did not realize that Freddie was in the constant drag, the makeup. I thought that perhaps there was a before and after. So I went and auditioned. And I was in my kind of punked out phase then. And I remember like greasing my hair back. And I had a little lead pencil in the glove compartment of my sports car, and I put lines under my eyes. And I went in, and I'm quite the motor mouth. I enjoy talking, but I really held back, reined in, and sort of sat there and let Wes tell the pitch of the plot. And I played a kind of a staring game with him. And I guess that's what sold him on it. I mean, I don't really know. The casting director also, Annette Benson, was a big fan of mine. She had just recently gotten very kind of popular because she discovered Nicolas Cage. And she'd seen me screen test for another project for about 6 roles. And so she'd sort of seen all the tricks I had up my sleeve. And I think she talked me up a lot to Wes. But I guess it was a combination of that staring game and Annette Benson being in my corner that got me the part. But that's the story.
The inspiration for Freddy Krueger came from a childhood experience Wes Craven had. One night while looking out his window, Craven saw an old man walking by his window wearing a fedora. Craven, who thought the man didn't see him, was shocked when the man turned around and stared at him with an evil grin. The image never left Craven's mind. Now, as for the title of the film, Craven stated that when he was a professor in college, the main street of the town that college was in was Elm Street. He also noted that JFK was shot on Elm Street in Dallas. Now, earlier I said that in the original script, Freddy Krueger was a child molester. However, right around the time of production, there was a national public outcry involving some high-profile cases involving child molestation. Both Shay and Craven agreed to change Krueger to a child killer instead of a molester, so people wouldn't think that they were sensationalizing real-life events. Although the film was supposed to be set in Springwood, Ohio, the filming took place in California, and throughout the film, you can see several palm trees in the background. The filmmaking process didn't go well for both Wes Craven and Bob Shaye. They were constantly at odds with each other, not just over budget concerns, but also plot details. The thing is, Craven had signed away the rights to the story to Bob Shaye and New Line Cinema. So in a sense, Shaye, as the producer, really had the final say on the film. Now, for the most part, Bob Shaye would let Craven do his thing, but for a few critical scenes, including the ending, Shaye put his foot down and demanded that the ending leave the story open for a possible sequel. Now, the way Craven had intended the film to end would be Nancy turns her back on Freddy, taking away his power. Then she wakes up to find out that everything that happened, including the death of her friends and mother, was all just a nightmare, hence the title. Being forced to reshoot the ending, Craven filmed the scene as we know it now, with Nancy waking up from the dream, saying goodbye to her mother, getting into Glenn's car with Rod and Tina, only to have the car come alive, trapping them and seemingly driving away on its own. While at the same time, Freddy's arm comes through a small window on the front door of the house, pulling Nancy's mother through it as credits roll. It was a compromise that Craven wasn't happy about, but the decision by Shaye to leave the story open would be a multi-million-dollar payday for Shaye and his struggling company.
The kids of Elm Street don't know it yet, but something is coming to get them.
There's something out there, isn't there?
We just see cuts happening.
What did that, Lieutenant?
I don't know.
Tina! What's the coroner got to say? He's in the jar and puking since he saw it.
They're gonna kill me for sure.
Did you do it?
There was somebody else there.
He was locked in a room with a girl who went in alive and came out in a rubber bag.
No one knows where it came from or who it will visit next.
Nancy? There's something wrong with you. You're imagining things.
Nightmare on Elm Street.
Do you believe in the boogeyman?
No.
Whatever you do, don't fall asleep.
No!
She's the only one who can stop it. If she fails,
I'm your boyfriend now, Nancy.
no one will survive. From Wes Craven director of The Hills Have Eyes and Last House on the Left, a new masterpiece in fantasy terror, Nightmare on Elm Street.
When Nightmare on Elm Street opened on November 9th, 1984, on 165 screens, it grossed $1.2 million opening weekend. That number was stunning to all parties involved, and the film quickly was given a much wider release. It would go on to gross $25 million. On top of all that money, the film was critically praised. Roger Ebert gave the film 3.5 stars out of 4, calling it one of the best films of 1984. And if you know anything about some of the films that came out that year, then you know that that is high praise. Now, on a side note, stay tuned later this year for a more in-depth look at the films of 1984. Now, you would think, with those kind of returns, all would be golden over at New Line Cinema, but not so fast. Earlier, I mentioned that a lot of side deals had to be made in order for Bob Shaye to get the funding needed. In one of those deals, Shaye lost a good chunk of the profits of the film, but Shaye was smart enough to keep the rights to the film and its characters. So given the monster success of the film, Shaye and New Line knew that they had to strike while the iron was hot. They quickly made plans for a sequel, but this time, the man who came up with the story was not going to be involved. Now, there are plenty of reasons why Craven didn't take part in the second film, but most people point to two main reasons. One, Craven thought that Elm Street was a complete story that didn't warrant a sequel. And two, the one that most people tend to agree with, was that the working relationship between Wes Craven and Robert Shaye was so strained that they were not even on speaking terms. Nevertheless, the second film was happening, and Bob Shaye needed to quickly put all the pieces together. First up was finding a script that would work, and the script that Bob Shaye went with was written by David Chaskin. The story was radically different from the first Elm Street. This time around, the protagonist was a boy named Jesse, and Freddy would use Jesse like an avatar to go after people that were fully awake and not dreaming. The film is a sequel, sort of, and I mean that as far as story-wise. It's not a standalone film like you get with Halloween 3. I mean this because the same house that Nancy Thompson lived in is the home that Jesse and his family now live in. And there's only one reference to the events in the first film, when Jesse's friend Lisa finds Nancy's diary and reads a passage detailing the events from the first film. Like the first film, there was a mix of new and familiar faces, including Mark Patton, Kim Myers, Hope Lang, Clu Klager, and, of course, Robert Englund reprising his role as Freddy Krueger. But that almost didn't happen. Englund's agent was now asking for a lot more money for his client, and Bob Shaye said no problem, and promptly recast someone else in the role of Krueger. New Line Cinema was proud of the fact that they would promote from within, and when searching for a director for Part 2, they didn't have to look very far. They went with Jack Shoulder, who worked for the company making trailers, and had directed one of the first feature films that New Line made, Alone in the Dark. Shoulder was given a $3 million budget to work with and got started on the film. About a week into production, it was clear to both Shoulder and Bob Shaye that something was very off. The actor who was playing Freddy was terrible, and after a couple of rewatches of the first film, it was obvious that Robert Englund brought so much to the character of Freddy that they had to have him back in that role. They worked out the financial issues, and Englund once again donned the makeup. The film was a rush job from start to finish, and just under a year from the time the first film was released, A Nightmare on Elm Street 2, Freddy's Revenge, was unleashed in theaters.
Someone is coming back to Elm Street. He is not friendly. He is not patient.
Kill for me!
And he is not a welcome visitor.
No!
But he has something terribly special for the new kid on the block.
It started to happen again.
Dad!
What's trouble? You've had some scary dreams, okay? Help!
Daddy can't help you now.
There's something inside of you.
Fight him! You are not afraid of him. He doesn't even exist.
Freddy Krueger is back on Elm Street.
Get out of here, Lisa!
Jesse, fight him!
Watch out for him. He'll be in your neighborhood soon. A Nightmare on Elm Street, Part 2.
You are all my children now.
Freddy's Revenge.
And the film took in almost $30 million, despite very poor reviews from critics and fans of the first film. Craven was among those disappointed with the film, citing the fact that it had nothing in common with the first film, no story arc or continuity. There was also a different kind of buzz starting to swirl around the film. Questions started coming up about the main character, Jesse. Why did he go to an S&M bar? Why did he stop making out with Lisa to run over to his friend Grady's house and ask him to spend the night with him? And what was the deal with the cleaning the room dance montage? Some were asking if his character was gay, and if the plot was a subtext about a person afraid to come out of the closet. For years, there was a debate about the so-called subtext. Most of the cast and crew said they were unaware of anything at the time of filming that would have led them to believe that the subtext was present. And director Jack Shoulder said that if the subtext was there, it was not filmed intentionally by him. But in 2010, screenwriter David Chaskin said that he did in fact write the film with every bit of the subtext in mind. And Mark Patton, who is now an openly gay man, said that he didn't think the character was written as a gay man, but he instantly picked up on every bit of the subtext while filming. Even though the film made more money than the first one, Bob Shaye knew that the film had strayed too far away from the formula of the first Nightmare on Elm Street, and he wanted to right the ship. So he reached out to Wes Craven and asked him if he would be interested in returning to the now franchise that New Line had. Although Craven didn't want to return to the directing chair, he did pen a script and reached out to Heather Langenkamp to let her know that he was writing her back into the story. Craven's script was big, full of new ideas, and after reading it, Bob Shaye liked it. But he also knew that there was no way that New Line could afford to produce the film as it was presented in the script. So Shaye did something, again to sort of upset Craven. He asked two up-and-coming filmmakers, Chuck Russell and Frank Darabont, to give the script a rewrite. Now, it's a common misconception that Wes Craven wrote the screenplay for Nightmare on Elm Street 3, The Dream Warriors. And yes, Darabont and Russell did retain some of the characters, including Nancy, in their version, but the script was a complete 180 from Craven's story. I was also one of those people that believed that Craven was the screenwriter. Now, here is something interesting. The author who wrote the novelization for the first three films used Craven's script of Part 3 for the source material for the book. So if you can find the book on Amazon, give it a read if you want to get the full picture of all the ideas in the story that Craven had presented with his version of A Nightmare on Elm Street Part 3. After Bob Shaye read the Russell/Darabont script, he offered Russell the directing job. This time the budget was set at $5 million. The story about the last of the Elm Street children being confined to a mental hospital for suicide attempts brought on by their dreams of Freddy also brings back Nancy Thompson, who has become a dream expert and is taking an experimental drug called Hypnosil that prevents the user from dreaming. One of the teenagers in the hospital, Kristen, who is played by Patricia Arquette, has the ability to bring people into her dreams. While in one of Kristen's dreams, Nancy realizes that Freddy is back. Now, Nancy helps the kids understand that in their dreams, they have abilities and powers that they can use to fight Freddy. Both Heather Langenkamp and John Saxon reprised their roles in Part 3, and when it was released, it was a massive hit, and the critics got right back on board with the series. The film grossed $44 million and brought Freddy into pop culture for the first time. Now, sure, horror movie fans knew Freddy, but not everyone knew his name. Now, he was everywhere. Part 3 was a game changer. This was the film that got it right. The whole story was spot on. The level of acting was much improved, and the special effects were fantastic. This was the last film in the franchise that didn't try to push the wisecracking Freddy Krueger that he would become synonymous with. Sure, there are a few scenes. The "welcome to primetime bitch" line that was ad-libbed by Robert Englund is one of the most iconic in the series, but he is still terrifying in this film. And along with parts 1 and 2, Part 3 is still a film that I cannot watch alone in the dark. The first Nightmare on Elm Street was lightning in a bottle, a supernatural thriller that changed the dynamic of horror films. Before that film, the killers in most slasher films were silent, but Freddy could speak, he could talk, and he was aware that it was the slow build-up to your death that would be the most torturous. With the second film, I think the filmmakers didn't know what they had on their hands. Freddy is noticeably absent from a good portion of the film, but to its credit, the film still has what I think is the scariest death in the entire franchise. The scene in which Grady is killed by Freddy still haunts me to this day, as Freddy slowly rises from what's left of Jesse's body and puts his hat on while slowly moving towards Grady, who is screaming for help to his parents who are just on the other side of his bedroom door. For just a moment, Freddy nods at Grady, as if to acknowledge that Grady's worst fear is about to happen. It's psychologically brutal. I don't think that scene gets enough credit. On next week's show, we were going to continue the discussion. But before I close out, I went to Twitter on Sunday and I asked, what is your favorite Elm Street film and why? Here's a few of the responses I received. First-time watchers said, the first one, because it's the correct answer. DJ Valentine gave me a couple answers. He said, well, it's definitely not the last one. And then he said, well, the first one traumatizes me to this day, but a close second, for its concept, is New Nightmare. Candace LePage wrote, number 3, Dream Warriors. These kids learn what's going on early and fight back. It's empowering. Also, awesome kills. Thank you, Candace. I agree. Hello, Katie said the original because it's a classic, and she said that she did enjoy the remake a bit. Well, we'll get to that one next week. My good friend, Ben Pritchard, who, by the way, happy birthday, Ben, said the first one. I'm 36. I can remember exactly where I was the first time I saw it as a kid and how I felt. Terrified. Thanks, Ben.
The famous glove, Freddy Krueger's glove. The original description in the script was fairly loose. Wes had a vision sort of in his mind of what it could do, but not how it was. He made the suggestion that it needs to be something that the guy could make himself with the things that you find in a boiler room. I did a sketch, a side view sketch of what the whole thing would look like, just to work out the geometry, how's this thing going to move, where the rivets need to be, how's it attached to the glove. And then I handed the work off to Lou Carlucci and Charlie Bellardinelli, who were two of my guys, to actually build the glove itself. We wanted to use a commercially available knife. This little Echo steak knife was the most brutal looking thing. Reground, remounted on the glove to make those long talons. I remember the first time Robert tried the glove on. First thing he did was cut himself, like everybody did, because we didn't realize that if you folded your fingers all the way, the knives went into your wrist. But then he sort of looked at Wes and got that smile on his face and went... That became his look with the glove.
Gonna get you. I really began to play with it. And that would be what happened to me. I always remember playing around in craft service and goofing in craft service with it, putting different, jujubes and marshmallows and putting jelly on it, making it look like guts and stuff like that. That's when I really got comfortable with it and really began to really get it into the frame.
By 1988, Bob Shea and his company, New Line, were printing money out of their offices. New Line Cinema was quickly being dubbed the house that Freddy built. Every time they made a film, it was made on the cheap, and it raked in huge returns. There was another trend that was starting to present itself as well. After the success of the third film, Bob Shea knew that those that were involved with the production would probably seek more money due to the high box office performance. Always wanting to keep costs under control, Shea opted to find another hungry, unknown director for the next installment of Elm Street. He found that person in Rennie Harlin. Harlin, who was from Finland, had just moved to Los Angeles after directing a few very low-budget Finnish films. Harlan jumped at the opportunity to make his first American film, and he didn't care that it was the fourth film in a horror movie franchise that he had never watched. The plot for Elm Street 4 was a direct sequel to the events of Part 3, with the three surviving characters, Kristen, Joey, and Kincaid, now out of the mental hospital. The actors who played Joey and Kincaid reprised their roles. However, the role of Kristen, which was played in Part 3 by Patricia Arquette, went to an actress by the name of Tuesday Knight. The reason for the recast was that Arquette was pregnant at the time of the production. The returning group of characters are back in high school along with a new group of friends. Once Freddy is resurrected by a dog who urinates fire, total mayhem ensues. Joey, Kincaid, and Kristen are quickly dispatched in the first 20 minutes of the film, leaving it up to the remaining friends to deal with Freddy. By the time this film came out, I was 10 years old and still dealing with the traumatic events of watching the first film 3 years prior. Now, as I mentioned last week, my folks did a good job keeping me from seeing R-rated films and such. But by the time you're 10 and have a group of friends that are the same age, you begin to want to seek films out like Elm Street 4. Now, watching a movie like that at my house was out of the question. Growing up, you always had that one friend whose parents didn't know or care what their kids were watching. In my case, that friend happened to live just 3 houses down from me, and in early '89, a group of 6 of us gathered in the basement of a rec room for a sleepover. I remember quite clearly that when I arrived at my friend's house, he would greet each of us at the door proudly holding up a VHS copy of Nightmare on Elm Street 4, The Dream Master, in his hand as if to say, "Get ready, it's on tonight." I was excited right up to the start of the film. Then the fear came over me once again. But it didn't last. I noticed something had changed. The film wasn't scary. Well, the first deaths of Joey and Kincaid maybe a little. But from that point in the film, the scares were gone. Instead, we were now treated to a wisecracking Freddy Krueger and a ton of over-the-top gore. All of a sudden it hit me. Freddy was now the star of the film. It was no longer about the gallant teenagers who would fight Freddy on his own turf. Now it was how creative can we get with Freddy's kills. The fact that they killed the 3 surviving characters in Part 3 so quickly confirmed this. The film itself did huge numbers at the box office. On its $7 million budget, it took in almost $50 million, and now Freddy was everywhere. Think about that opening scene in Rocky III after Rocky beats Apollo Creed to become world heavyweight champion. We're treated to a musical montage of Rocky reaping the benefits of his success. You see him doing commercials and ads in magazines, living the high life. Well, the same could now be said for Freddy Krueger. He was now a superstar, appearing in cameos and everything from him hosting an hour-long show on MTV, his own 900 call-in number, video games, books, clothing, dolls, and even his own album of songs by Freddy. New Line was making a mint just off the merchandising of Freddy alone, and they made an attempt to parlay that success into a TV spin-off show. In late 1988, Freddy's Nightmares, Nightmare on Elm Street the series, debuted in syndication. The show was an anthology series, much like Tales from the Crypt, with Freddy introducing segments in the style of the Crypt Keeper. The pilot episode was a little interesting. It was directed by Texas Chainsaw Massacre director Tobe Hooper and told the story of how Freddy came to be, complete with a courtroom scene in which Freddy is set free due to a search warrant not being signed in the correct place. Now, if you thought the films had a low budget, you haven't seen anything yet. The TV show was shot on videotape and had the production value of most porn films in the 80s. But because the show was in syndication, New Line could sell the rights to individual television stations around the world. And given the popularity of Freddy at the time, they made a ton of money. They would go on to make 44 episodes before the negative backlash about the show's quality caught up with them and finally pulled the plug on the series. Now, in mid-1989, I was 11 years old and 2 of my friends and I made our way to the grand opening of a brand new movie theater in town, the Empire 4 Cinema. We were there on opening night, and our film of choice was the eagerly anticipated Hulk Hogan film, No Holds Barred. Now, in the mainstream, the film may not have been that big of a deal, but to 3 11-year-olds, there was nothing bigger than wrestling. By the time we made it to our seats, it was a packed house. It was almost standing room only. And as soon as the lights dim, something happened that I've only experienced one other time years later when I saw Star Wars Episode 1 in the theater. The audience started cheering and chanting, Hogan, Hogan, over and over again. The chants were deafening, and I didn't know exactly how to handle it. The crowd was doing this during the trailers. Now, even at 11, I loved the trailers. I found this to be a little annoying. Hogan, Hogan. They chanted that all the way through the trailer for Ghostbusters 2. They chanted it through the trailer for the new Indiana Jones film. It didn't matter. Trailer after trailer, the crowd only got louder. As the last trailer started to roll, the image on the screen was a tattered, Gothic-style baby carriage. As the camera zoomed closer to the carriage, Freddy's glove bursts out and swipes at the screen. The crowd screamed as loud as ever, and all of a sudden, the chant changed. Instead of Hogan, Hogan, it was now Freddy, Freddy. I look over to my friends who were caught up in the chanting as well. I just sat there thinking to myself 2 things. First, boy, they're coming out with another film awful fast. And second, did none of the people in the crowd have the same traumatic experience as I did? I couldn't bring myself to participate in the chanting. When the trailer was over and the movie started, the crowd resumed their Hogan chant, and it lasted all the way through the film and into the parking lot afterwards. Never underestimate the drawing power of Hulk Hogan in the late 80s. It wouldn't be until early 1990 that I would finally get a chance to see Nightmare on Elm Street 5, The Dream Child, again at the same friend's house as where I watched Part 4. This time around, Bob Shaye hired British director Stephen Hopkins to helm the project. Hopkins attempted, but was not successful in trying to make the film darker in its tone than Part 4. To its credit, the film does have a more gothic feel to its art direction. This time, the plot has Freddy invading the dreams of Alice's unborn child. Along with Alice, Dan is the only returning character from Part 4, and Dan is the first to be killed. The film relied heavily on gore effects, almost to the point of obscene, and once again Freddy delivered his now signature deadpan humor when killing his victims.
His mother was a God-fearing woman. His birth was an unspeakable horror.
Please don't let him do that!
His life and death have been one incredible nightmare. But now all that is going to change because Freddy wants to become a daddy.
Want to make babies?
What's wrong with me? You're just a little pregnant.
Even if he has to adopt.
Do unborn babies dream?
When it comes to chills.
It happened while I was awake.
When it comes to screams.
The party just started.
When it comes to pure terror.
Bon appetit!
No one delivers like Freddy.
Better buckle up.
All right, Krueger. This time it's for keeps.
A Nightmare on Elm Street 5, The Dream Child.
It's a boy!
When it comes to terror, remember, Freddy knows best.
Now, for the record, I think this is the worst of the entire franchise. I wasn't a fan of Part 4, but it's tolerable. Part 5 is just a mess. It also has one of the smallest body counts in the entire franchise. Moviegoers agreed, and when the film was released only 9 months after the fourth film, on an $8 million budget, it brought in a lackluster $22 million, less than half of what Part 4 took in. And fans of the series spoke very negative about Part 5, and it continues to this day to have a score of only 33% on Rotten Tomatoes. The term jumping the shark is used to reference something that's lost its way and needs to do something big to bring the audience back on board. And in 1991, Bob Shane Company had a plan to right the ship after the disaster that was The Dream Child. Their decision was to end the franchise with the death of Freddy. Now, Rachel Talalay, who had been part of the franchise since day one, was given a chance to direct the film, and New Line pulled out all the stops to make sure they send Freddy out with style.
As a boy, he was always different.
No one understood him.
You ready for it, boy? It's time to take your medicine.
Thank you, sir.
No one could control him.
Go inside, honey.
But now, it's a new beginning. The beginning of the end for Freddy.
Every town has an Elm Street. Screaming while the bus is in motion.
It's your mind or go for it.
I'll get you, my pretty, and your little soul, too.
We're gonna have to hit him with everything we got.
Now I'm playing with power.
We're in Twin Peaks here.
It's gotta be me and him.
You want to live?
Freddy's Dead. The final nightmare.
Great graphics.
They saved the best for last.
With cameos including Roseanne and Tom Arnold, Alice Cooper, and Johnny Depp. And the last 15 minutes of the film were shot in 3D, a filming technique that had been abandoned since the early 80s. They were holding nothing back, and on opening weekend of Freddy's Dead: The Final Nightmare, myself, now 13, tried unsuccessfully to get into a screening of the film. I bought a ticket to some random PG-13 rated film and planned to sneak into this movie. As I walked down the narrow hallway towards the last theater where the film was being shown, I was shocked to see that 2 theater employees were standing guard to prevent underage people from entering. But nevertheless, I continued walking. Don't worry, I thought to myself. Just act like you have a ticket. Don't look nervous and just walk right past them. As I got even closer, their eyes fixed on me, and one of them started to laugh. "Stop right there," the laughing employee said to me. "Don't even try it." Any confidence that I may have had emptied right out of me. I turned around and ran away. It wouldn't be till the home video release of the film that I would get my chance to watch Freddy's farewell tour. But by this time, restrictions on what content I could watch were lifted somewhat, and I was able to rent the film myself. As I sat down to watch part 6 of the series, again, that ever-lingering fear came back. But it only lasted 5 minutes. The very first time you see Freddy on screen, he is riding a broom and says the line, "I'll get you, my pretty, and your little soul too." What the fuck is going on here? How on earth did Freddy get reduced to this? He's not telling jokes. He is a joke, and the entire film is nothing but Looney Tunes fodder. I will say, though, the gimmick of killing Freddy was enough to drive the film to top of the box office on opening weekend, and when it was all said and done, Freddy's Dead: The Final Nightmare made $34 million, more than Part 5, but not close to the numbers of Parts 3 and 4. If this was to be Freddy's farewell, then it wasn't the grand send-off they all hoped for, and the film's Rotten Tomatoes score is even lower than Part 5, at only 20%. I think the film was slightly better than Part 5, but that's like me saying, I'm happy it's the rear tire that's flat, rather than the front. So the series was over. Freddy had his run. There were some great highs and some awful lows, but he left his mark on pulp culture, and he made Bob Shaye and his small company a ton of money. By the early 1990s, New Line Cinema was producing far bigger budget mainstream films, and the future would be very bright for Shaye and company. However, he did take the sting of the backlash of the last Freddy film personally, and it was pestering him for a couple of years. By early 1994, he knew that he had to produce at least one more film in the series. He had to bring Freddy back one more time. But how? There was only one person in his mind that could accomplish this, the man who started the whole thing, Wes Craven. But Shaye and Craven hadn't spoken in years. Craven resented not only the bastardization of his original story, but the millions that Shaye had made from it. To get Craven back on board, Shaye would have to make things right first, and that's exactly what he did. He gave Wes Craven a piece of the merchandising and back pay on some of the profits of the previous films. So with that settled, it was time for Craven to get to work on the story. After he rewatched all of the sequels, Craven had no idea what to make of the mess that he saw. He would come up with a much cleverer idea. Instead of another sequel, what if the story was set in the real world? What if Freddy was real? And started to go after those involved in the production of the first Elm Street film. Craven reached out to Heather Langenkamp and asked her if it would be okay to center the story around her using elements of her real life, including the fact that Heather's husband is a special effects guy and that she has a young son. Uneasy about it, she did give Craven the okay.
Mark it, common mark.
I'm doing a film about my nightmares as I'm dreaming them. In order for the movie to continue, it was dependent on me having more nightmares. Well, fortunately, I did.
I'm a little frightened by what Wes may have tapped into. I frankly felt that it was over when we did the final nightmare.
In a town where movies go over schedule and directors go over budget, something far more evil is out of control.
Film suffered its own terror today as 2 of Hollywood's best-known special effects technicians were found dead.
Part of the theme of the movie is becoming like part of the making of the movie.
Can you come with me in my dreams?
I think that only happens in the movies.
What happens when the story dies? The evil is set free. Now that the films have ended, the genie's out of the bottle. That's what the nightmare nightmares are telling me, and that's what I'm writing.
This is still a script we're talking about, right, Wes?
These kind of crossover out of films into our reality. The only way to stop him is to make another movie.
Oh my God.
The bad man's getting awful close.
You're gonna have to make a choice.
What kind of choice?
Whether or not you're willing to play Nancy one last time.
Cut the effect!
Isn't there somebody who can stop him?
That person's you.
Who, I mean?
It was you that gave Nancy her strength. Nancy.
Where's my son?
Bob Shaye was crazy about the script and green-lit it with an $8 million budget. But Craven didn't just pen the screenplay. He was back in the director's chair. So after 5 sequels, it was only fitting that he would close out the story.
Yeah, every one of us in that series had been somehow touched forever by the phenomenon of Nightmare on Elm Street, you know. Robert Englund was always known as Freddy, and Nancy, Heather and Nancy were inextricable. New Line Cinema had sort of been built on it. So when I came away from that conversation, I called up Bob Shaye and I said, you know, I think I want to make a movie about the phenomenon of the movie and use that as the basis and jump outside the stories entirely, and also try to deal with this whole idea of censorship and whether horror films are good or bad or whether they cause people to do things. Because that has been sort of a growing and insistent question continuously asked of me, and I think everybody else making horror films, is, aren't you afraid your films cause this or that? And my sense was, again, going all the way back to Greek mythology, is there's a lot of great literature that is about horror, and that somehow a story about horror, in a sense, exercises it or gives it a form. It's the same as Nancy dragging the hat out of her dream. It's the beginning of being able to come to terms with it. And that if you were to prevent these stories, you would, in a sense, be allowing something that is ineffable to sort of travel unimpeded through our consciousness, because it would not have a name, it would not have a shape given to it, so that in any sense we could recognize it. So that became the essence of it. You know, stopping the stories of Freddy has really allowed Freddy to cross over into real life. And it was kind of a subtle warning to the censors on my part to say, you know, back off unless you want to experience the real thing rather than seeing it in cinema, you know. And it also seemed to be the freshest way to approach the kind of the 10th year anniversary of the genre, which it, in fact, that was. You know, almost to the month, it was the 10th year of the original Nightmare on Elm Street.
In 1994, I was 16 years old, and with a driver's license in my possession, I now had the freedom and independence that so many teenagers long for. In September 94, I was watching a rented VHS tape, and much like you can expect trailers from a rented DVD, they would play on VHS as well. Albeit that you could fast forward them, a function that most DVDs have locked, so you're forced to watch them. In any case, I was watching the trailer for what was clearly a horror film. Fast edits, lots of screaming, and for a split second, I saw an image of Nancy from Elm Street. What is this? What am I watching? And at the very end of the trailer, the title pops up, Wes Craven's New Nightmare. What? And then who pops out of a closet? None other than Freddy himself. He looks directly into the camera and says, "Miss me?" Well, no, I haven't missed you. In October of that year, I drove to the theater, purchased a ticket to my first Elm Street movie, Wes Craven's New Nightmare. Yes, after 6 movies, this was going to be the first Freddy film that I would see in theaters. And to my surprise, I really enjoyed the film. Gone was the wisecracking Freddy. In his place was a much darker and more evil entity. The premise of the film, Freddy in real life, got to me, and I found myself once again dealing with the fear that hadn't really been present since watching Part 3 all the way back in '87. Sadly, however, the film underwhelmed at the box office. Despite some of the strongest reviews in the franchise, the film took in only $19 million. Sure, that's more than double the film's budget, but nothing close to the expectations that Bob Shea had hoped for. The film does enjoy cult status and a Rotten Tomatoes score of 70%. Any hopes of restarting the franchise were over. A year before the release of New Nightmare, a seed was planted. At the end of Jason Goes to Hell, the final Friday, as Jason's iconic hockey mask lay on the dirt, Freddy's razor gloves comes from underneath the ground and pulls it down. This was a tease of something to come. New Line Cinema had acquired the rights to the Friday the 13th franchise, but after the very poor performance of New Nightmare, the idea of a Freddy vs. Jason movie was shelved. For the next 9 years, fans of both series would gather bits and pieces from the internet involving rumors about the possibility of the film happening. In fact, New Line spent $6 million just in development and had some 18 scripts submitted to them. But nothing really grabbed the executives at New Line enough to greenlight a film. It wasn't until 2002 when a script written by Damian Shannon and Mark Swift was given the go-ahead. And New Line brought on Ronnie Yu as the director. Yu, who wasn't a fan of either of the franchises, he didn't want the job at first. But after a few meetings and promises that he could make the film as he saw it without studio interference, he came on board. A lot had changed in the 9 years since the last Elm Street. New Line was acquired by Ted Turner and eventually Time Warner, and was a publicly traded company and had a lot more money in their coffers. And Freddy vs. Jason was given a massive, by comparison, budget of $30 million. Robert Englund returned one last time to reprise his role as Freddy. As for myself, in 2003, I was now an adult, living on my own, making my way in the world. When I watched the first trailer for the film, I was on board. Horror movies weren't really my thing by that point in my life, but Freddy was still present in my psyche. So on opening night, I returned for another round with Krueger. As for the film itself, it was all right. I would say it's more Jason's adventure than Freddy's. But when we finally get to the big showdown at the end, it was fun. And as for the ending, if you're a fan of either franchise, you can both claim victory. However, one ending they had planned was to see both Freddy and Jason battling out in hell, only to have Pinhead from the Hellraiser series make an appearance. How did the film do in theaters? Critics hated it, but audiences, hungry to revisit childhood memories, flocked to the cinema in droves. Freddy vs. Jason took in $30 million in its first weekend alone and would go on to gross over $100 million worldwide. It was the biggest haul for either franchise. The 2000s saw the emergence of a company named Platinum Dunes. One of its co-founders was Michael Bay. The sole purpose of this company was to acquire the rights to classic horror movie properties and remake them. Their first remake was the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, followed by the Amityville Horror, The Hitcher, another Texas Chainsaw, and another Texas Chainsaw. But in early 2008, rumors were abound that their next film was going to be a remake of the first Nightmare on Elm Street. This one grabbed my attention. Putting my feelings about remakes aside, I was intrigued, and I followed the development of this project closely, doing weekly internet searches on the progress of the film. The producers had made some interesting choices. They brought in Samuel Behr, who had directed the now famous Smells Like Teen Spirit Nirvana video back in the early 90s, and with the way CGI effects had developed in the late 2000s, I began to think that they would be able to really ratchet up some of the dream landscapes in the film. For a while, it looked like Robert Englund would be cast in the role of Freddy, but at the last minute they went with Jackie Earle Haley, an actor who began his career in the 1970s in The Bad News Bears, and received an Oscar nomination for his role in the film Little Children. When the first trailer debuted in late 2009, I must have watched it 10 times in a row, trying to decipher what I was seeing. It was clear that Freddy was not going to be the wisecracker of the later Elm Street films. The film appeared to have all the hallmarks of a great horror movie, and in April 2010, I bought my ticket for an 11 a.m. Friday morning showing, opening weekend.
I had another nightmare last night. That burned man with the striped sweater, he keeps trying to kill me. I ran a different way this time. I ended up in front of a preschool. I woke up before I had a chance to explore, but that has to mean something. He chased me into the preschool this time. I got away, made it down into the basement. But it feels like that's where he wants me to go. Like, he needs me to find something. I'm starting to dream with my eyes open. I can't tell what's real anymore. I haven't slept in 3 days. If I sleep, I dream. If I dream, I'm dead. Is there anybody else out there that this is happening to? Can somebody help me? Please?
It took all of 15 minutes to realize I was watching garbage. Pure garbage. In fact, a friend of mine who was there in the theater with me sent me a text 20 minutes in that read, "Why the fuck are we still here? I'm out. Peace." He got up and left. Every time I try to watch the film again, I'm dismayed by the plot, the bad acting, and the fact that with such great source material they churned out such a dull movie, even by horror movie standards. It's a real shame. Now, I'm sure we haven't seen the last of Freddy Krueger, and I'm sure that in whatever incarnation that he reappears in, I will put down the money to see it in film. But I don't want my negative thoughts on the later work to deter you from seeing the first 3 films, especially parts 1 and 3. They are classic, and they will stand the test of time. My name is Dana Buckler, and thank you so much for listening.
After we finished the film, we showed it to Frank Mancuso and the other people at Paramount. They called me up and said, "We're sorry, we don't want to take this film because audiences are not interested in movies about dreams." So by default, we had to move ahead and distribute the film on our own. I remember driving by a big theater on Broadway in New York on opening night, and there was lines around the block. I'd never seen that with any of our films. It seemed to have worked. Freddy. What Freddy holds in my heart is Robert Englund, who's a terrific trooper, a very good actor, a gentleman, and a certain amount of a scholar. So, and also I feel the same about Wes.
I mean, the whole thing of Nightmare on Elm Street really was based on Eastern philosophy that I was studying at that time. Most of us are down, at the bottom level where, we go about our daily lives and everything else, but we don't think about a lot of things. And then next up is, like businessmen, and then there's artists, and then there's mystics, and then the farther up you go, the more uncomfortable it is. Just before the top, you get to the point where you either commit suicide, or you go back down, or you break through into real enlightenment. But you have to take, at that point, total responsibility for consciousness. And that was kind of what I built that whole thing around. And sleep, by that, is the paradigm of not being conscious. So in order to be conscious, the most primal things you have to do is stay awake. With some slasher films, I think it's just blood and guts and torture and things like that, which are pretty reliably upsetting, but I think kind of a cheat, To me, it's much more about the social, economic, psychological zeitgeist of what's going on in the culture at the time that I try to get at.